Kid of Arcadia, Chapter 2, No Man's Land, earlier that summer. Far away, a little boy lived on an asteroid, catching comets in a net with a girl stuck down in a rose. There, middle school half-wits cracked jokes in a locker room, and cartoon space pilots flew the starfield, and only a half hour divided them. It was where Pinwheel unleashed its characters in a kaleidoscope, from that old cloth cat Bagpuss to the little wide-eyed Simon in his land of chalk drawings. From PBS to CBS I was there, and just as wide-eyed to all that trippy haze they shared. That was me in there every day, when our TV broadcast its lineup, driving me non-stop to exhaustion just to pick up speed again. And that was like me up till then. I lived off the TV in them days. So when Dad first called earlier that summer, this was back in 1981 by the way, I couldn't be bothered with him. And where was I? I was chest down on the den carpet snacking on cheese crackers and soaking up the TV's glow in our dim basement apartment as Mom prepped for work. His call had made her late, so she stood anxiously wrapping the cord around her fingers and talking at the wall to make sure I stayed out of it. Oh well, I was too glued to our good old 13-incher room away. That afternoon I'd been down sweating through some old black and white war flick from where the screen was lighting up the room as all the men went charging the trenches through it. Blood was coating their faces in there with the kicked-up sand, tripwires were snagging their guts, and a million bullets were spilling their brains once crawling out the mud of no man's land. It was a knockout to watch at 11 years old. Mom, why'd they call it no man's land? I began with my questions, just trying to keep her around. Because that's where we live, Jared, she said, still holding the phone with Dad on the other end. I got the joke. One station down was the preacher show at that time, where the old guy with the thinning hair and thick-rimmed glasses would be stomping and clapping in a room full of people to that old-time gospel, and put your hand in the hand of the man, etc. But they'd always stop and kill the vibe and do that boring talk with the old guy looking right at me like he could see through the screen. I had no idea what he was on about, and all it did was remind me of Dad, who had also been talking about being born again earlier that year. So, still not wanting to think much about him, I changed the channel. Then what seemed like 100 commercials were playing before I decided to punch the dial again, only to end up adding to the year of my life spent chasing colors through the snow a channel up. It was one of those static, dead-air channels, which always made me wonder what else might have been going on in there as I jogged the remote. I'd been told by my friend Broder that if you stared at that long enough, you'd start to see the juicy shit. So of course I always would, and of course I always did, even if just for a moan or some flash of something pink. And jackpot, I could hear it. Ah. No more of that. Change it, Mom said, peering around the corner, so I jumped and buttoned down the remote. I could tell Dad's call was huge under that day, but I tried to ignore it by turning up the volume. I always try to ignore his calls. With ion zones and evil drones, that'll keep them on their toes. Bright and noisy, I loved the Atari commercials. Every time a video game ad played, it felt like those space warships were surrounding me on all sides in their tireless pursuit, like something out of a movie, if only for a moment. I swear they stitched a new gotta-have-it thrill cord to my brain from that Toys Electric Patrick between 3-2-1 Contact, The Third Eye, and You Can't Do That on Television, and it only grew tighter by the day. That thrill for me was always the dream of the video arcade, but now they said they had brought the world of the Star Wars future home. So I saw it in my dreams, the gamer kid with his rad shades and sleek sneaks curling up on the black and white checkerboard floor. Laser-crazed, his tongue wetting his lips like the Death Valley sun had pruned them, his sweaty palms sliding on the console's controls, his flexing glutes thrusting his stiff core against the cabinets. Hot damn, the future was slick, sexy, and came coin-operated, and man did I want to see myself in its eye. I sat up and pointed at the screen all whipped up and turned on. Woo, fucking bonus, I shouted, hoping Dad might hear. Jared, you want to talk to your dad? Mom asked. I shook my head with a sigh and a groan, having hoped she wasn't going to ask me that. Not now, I said. She threw the phone back on the hook and puffed her own sigh in frustration to make me feel guilty about dodging him again. Don't make a mess, we got the social worker coming over this evening and it's something big. I can't even deal with it right now, so I'll just tell you when I get home, she said. I gulped. That was the last thing I wanted to hear. I would have rather had her just dump the whole surprise on me later that evening if that lady was coming over. I'm going to be late. Are you going to Broder's? She asked, slinging her purse around her shoulder. I sighed. Yeah, Mom, I'll go to Broder's. So after a kiss on my cheek and a pat on my shoulder, she was gone, and soon all I could hear beyond the commercial jingles were her footsteps clacking down the baking concrete path outside. She always left me with nothing but the box when she worked, and if I didn't have some escape, I would have gone cuckoo down there on a stuffy afternoon like that. Dad was on my mind too, and that was never a good thing to have when alone. So I shut the box off about the time Dallas came on and threw on my tightest tee and athletic shorts, still feeling a thrill turning me on from the TV. Dressing up for Broder was always a fun exercise because I wanted him to notice it, because he was the smartest guy I knew, and the only guy I really knew, this teen guy down the street. I may not have had a dad around, but I had Broder, and he could usually be reached through the proverbial back window when Mom couldn't hold the door for me into the masculine realm. And since anything good enough for him was good enough for me, I wanted him to be impressed. I took the basketball Dad had given me, just in case Broder wanted to shoot with me. He had a hoop on his garage. And just like that, I was set loose in my old neighborhood as usual, that land of baking driveways, triple-deckers, and side-gable bungalows every which way you looked. Down those back road one-ways of East Rochester, I used to dash in and out every shortcut and bypass behind houses and trudge the swamps, dead lots, and rusty junkyards to get where I was going. That day I hit the curb with my skateboard under a burnt-out streetlight where weeds grew out of every crack with the broken glass. It was my world and the only one I knew by hand. Broder lived in a brown bungalow up the street from the four-room basement of a flat Mom rented, each with its own battle scars, ours graced with peeling paint and rusted gutters upstairs growing grass, and his with green mold on the shadow side. Nature always found a way in, and so did I. Once past his front screen door foyer and up some narrow wooden stairs, I could usually find him kicking back in his half-story loft. The two of us had more time to get on and off up there those sweaty afternoons with no parents around, and though he was often stuck in with his migraines, he always kept his back door unlocked just for me. Broder never minded me dropping by. The first thing he did when he saw me stroll into his upstairs loft of a room that day, in the tight attire I was in, was reach down in his desk drawer and pull out a hash brownie wrapped in a paper towel. He turned my way in his swivel chair with it. "Here," he said, pinching off a piece. "Bonus!" I shouted. I threw down the basketball I'd carried over and snatched up what he was holding instead. A friend of his made these hash treats from time to time, and it was the kind of thing we'd never talk about around the Grups. "What's up?" he asked. I sighed. Mom and Dad going at a long distance again. "Typical, so you come here," he said. His heavy black bangs and eyebrows weighed down his eyes as he gave me a quick look down before he turned his thin, pale frame back to his video games. He never looked like he fit the room and was always hunching over in it the taller he got. He was very much a teen by then, full teen guy mode, but also had this delicate slowness I certainly didn't. And I liked his smell that day. He smelled like he'd just come from a leafy greenhouse, and I knew it meant he wouldn't quite be himself. He had toked somewhere that morning and probably didn't even notice it, but I did. It had a way of sticking in his clothes like it did his brain. To me it was a guy smell, so it was a good smell. I probably threw myself in his bed beneath the window, kicked off my sneaks and tube socks, and teased the wiles off with his model airplanes while he just tried to ignore me from his corner. His Star Wars figures on the shelf were remnants of the boy he'd been just 4 short years before in '77, but now he was 16. Growing up had him on the run from all that, but for some reason he never wanted to pass any of it down to me. Computers and conspiracies filled his head now, and he even had this theory about mock-men, robots in human skin, who are carrying out evil plots in the world. He wore a charm bracelet just so I'd know it was still him. He had issues for sure, but who didn't? He idolized Gary Newman. "Can I play?" I asked. He was playing his Atari Pro-Am. Soon we had a 2-player hooked up on a television propped on a milk crate beneath his desk, and we were sitting cross-legged on his clothes-strewn floor with knobs in our laps. A thin plastic sheet hung on the screen with a basketball court design or something, and shining through were 2 white slates scrolling the sides in the black space. And just like that we'd get to shoot our hoops anyway and not even have to leave the room, even if those pixels left something to be desired for sure. Every time he screwed himself in the game, he'd plant his fucks and shits in the air, often following them with a smack to his own 13-incher, and then be rocking back and forth for minutes to an unheard groove. That was his strategy. "Smooth move, Axlax," he laughed, having knocked the dot past my paddle into the screen's own no man's land. "Fuck, ooh," I joked, my mouth full of hash brownie. I gulped it down so hard that I burped really loud, full throttle. Decent, Broder replied. Man, did that make me feel good, just knowing I'd done something he was impressed by, but it was short-lived. I kept turning my knob the wrong way on the Pro-Am, so I stood to stretch when I got tired of him kicking my ass. Already I was feeling cramped in the mess of clothes and computers and weighed down by the shit-brown slant over my head, but I was still turned on by that TV thrill from earlier, and though he seemed right at home in that thicket on the floor, he jumped up and dwarfed my stand. He slipped one of his bony arms around my waist, but I bent away, so he ruffled my shaggy black mop-top with the other. He liked touching my hair. "Dude, I finally got my game debugged. I worked on it all week," he said, sitting back down in the swivel chair. He leaned over toward the television and flipped a switch so his trash 80s black screen could hum on atop his desk. Then he typed in a string of code and hit return, and all the words blinked off for a white maze that crept up on the black. In the game, he was a square that had to move through an endless number of mazes, looking out for the other critters hell-bent to hurt him. And with no score and only one life, if he died, there was no second chance, and if he lived, there was no sweet reward. I still couldn't believe he had actually coded his own game. And it looked easy, but as it rolled on, every level built speed until they flashed like a film reel at his every twitch. After the first 10 minutes, he began to smile, biting his bottom lip like a fisherman reeling in his trophy catch. His every nerve spent satisfying every obstacle, and all I could do was stand by amazed the whole time, waiting for him to die. Then at some point he reached the game end screen. The stuffy bedroom air chilled, the golden, long-shadowed afternoon swept in before I realized it, and the whole scene came to a halt. A half hour had gone by, and he was finally pushing daisies, dead. He thrust backwards in his chair and frantically scratched away that gamer's itch we both knew so well that could cost you another quarter in the asteroids we used to play at the local by the slice. "So that's the game you were making?" I asked. "Yeah, we hauled it to the science fair last weekend," he explained, pulling out a hand-sized first-prize wooden plaque and tossing it on the bed beside me. "My uncle from Silicon Valley came all the way over here to help me finish it. He called it Eternal Return, which sounded kind of badass." And with that, we had hit a special spot in the conversation where a smart guy like Broder was finally willing to start spilling his guts after being so buzzed out for so long. But now the trouble was getting him to stop. Now he boiled over with excitement and could have spent the next several hours telling me all about the computers he was working on and the games he had. So I had to bring him back to earth. "Still looks like berserk," I said. "Well, you still look like a dick, so," he replied, wiping his sweaty face. His arms trembled like they always did during a migraine. "Fucker, you're just mad I always beat your ass." "Hey man, I just don't want you to work on that game you made all day again," I spelled out. "And I don't want to spend all day with some short-dick kid bugging me, but you're still here." He slumped in his chair, holding his head. "Damn, this is really hurting now." "I just thought you'd," I sighed, sitting back on his bed to clutch that basketball to my chest. Sometimes we let our true feelings slip like that when we were stoned. "Just thought I'd what?" he asked, scratching his crotch. "Just forget it," I said. His shoulders fell. "Whatever, man. Sorry you're bored and shit, but I was toking all morning," he said. I sunk my face and pouted my eyes the way I knew could make a person's heart melt, just to get him sweating a little more, the way his mom usually got me feeling guilty. "Cut that shit out. It's unmanly," he said. He pointed at me cross-eyed, rose up from the bed, and stuck his bony arms in the air, stretching high and wide, with little veins popping out as he released, and then staggered over close to me. I could tell he was feeling guilty now. "What do you mean?" I asked. "You know, cut it out, the way you're being all clingy and needy and shit. I ain't your dad." I looked away and blushed. You want to go to the labs or something?" he asked. I could see blood rising in his cheeks just as I could feel it running in mine. "What about your folks?" I asked. He chuckled and shook his head. "Forget them, man. I don't want to deal with that bullshit right now anyways, man. I'm bugging out, like totally fucked. I ate too much of that shit, and it's really sinking now, so let's just go." "Yeah, I just don't want to go home tonight, I said, thinking of the social worker's visit. "I know," he said. Every now and then I'd beg him to go down to the labs, but he seldom seemed as interested. The labs was one of his favorite spots from his former life he'd once turned me on to years before, and then suddenly no longer cared about once he hit high school. Like everything else he'd given up on, though, it was still a fun time to a kid like me, and because he wanted me around, he sometimes came along like that. So that early blue evening we blew through the last rays of daylight and then some over near Tripod, the water tower by the tracks, and I got to fart around the few more hours I wouldn't have to think about that lady's visit. Broder nearly fell asleep on the ground in a toke smoky daze, watching my every move. Sometimes we had the place to ourselves like that, but it wasn't just our hangout. In fact, all the neighborhood kids were in on the laps. Everyone had their own myths about it, and not all of them were good, as I was soon to learn. When we were making our way back in the dark that night under the streetlights on the vacant street, I asked Broder, who was still high as the sky, why he didn't go to the laps much anymore, and he admitted something to me that I never forgot. He said it was because he didn't want to get messed up with the chicken hawks, and especially not this nameless guy in shades he'd just heard about. He said he'd been told how this guy would come rolling up beside the Tripod in the tracks around dusk in this old Chevy 2, which all seemed oddly specific to me, and how, out of all the usual junkies and shifty gangs who'd hang out back there, that guy was the one you really didn't want to come across because he was only out there to screw with the boys. I had no idea what that really meant, and I'm sure he wouldn't have talked like that if he wasn't stoned, but something odd was coming out of him that night as he stumbled and stammered along those dimly lit suburban back roads. He's what's called a chicken hawk, a queer who goes after boys, he explained as we walked. This guy, man, he starts out by giving you some money and takes you into town to blow it, and he really does make good on it too, getting you shit. He gets you all pumped up and makes you feel good, but it's only the first step because by the time the lights go up, you're long gone already, till he feels like bringing you back. Why is he called a chicken hawk? I asked. Because chicken hawks beat up on little birds. But see, there's the thing, Broder continued, lowering his voice. The thing is, the real trouble starts when you want to come home. 'Cause the more you ask, the farther out he goes. And dude, anything you want can be gotten easy. But see, then you get taken to his hideout, and you're shacked up in the works with the hotel bed sheets and the room service and TV, and it's rad. But the more you ask about going back, the more treats he gives you, like you're some little prince. Then he waits until those drugs he gave you when you weren't looking make you too out of it to fight back, and then he gets your hands tied up and everything comes off, and you don't stop until he's filled you like a cream donut. He chuckled nervously. So I chuckled in reply, not sure how to take it. I know about this guy now and what he's been doing out there, okay? So that's why if you're gonna go anywhere near the tracks, I should go with you, 'cause I'll bust the fucker up real good, he shouted, beating his fists. He told me how the boy is always returned and just dumped on the side of the road in the morning, and then how he's home by sunrise with no idea what happened, but feeling funny. The drugs make the memories go away, he told me, but not all of them. And since it's not something any real guy wants to admit to, they never do, and that just makes it easier for the chicken hawks to scout out new boys to screw with. The guy is smart about who he picks, he told me. On top of all that, it seemed that even in a world of barbed wire, few well-meaning people dared cross into that no-man's land to check out what a boy was doing on the side of the road, even if they saw him get dropped off there. They want no part in it, and might just wait for a cop to bring the little numbskull in instead. He said ordinary people aren't that smart about who they help. The boys don't want to admit to it because they don't want to be laughed at for getting probed, Broder said, chuckling. The whole thing embarrassed me to even listen to, and I just shook my head, wondering how he knew it all so well. Whether he was just trying to spook me or what, I didn't buy it, because no kid was that stupid to just go trusting random dudes in the woods, and if they were, then they deserved what they got, I thought. It wasn't even the kind of thing I thought could happen to guys like us, and just picturing a boy getting probed made me chuckle at it with him, if just to ease the uneasiness. It sounded just like one of his paranoid conspiracies he'd tell me about when stoned, out in the safety of the open sidewalk. Some I believed and some I didn't. Just don't fight it. It hurts more, he said. Okay, I shrugged, kicking a pebble down the dark sidewalk. The summer night crickets were deafening. See, you're just a kid. You go there because you think it's all cool and fun, but you always run home when it's dark. You got no idea what it's really like to get around, he said. So how do you know about him? I asked. He rolled his eyes and stuck his hands in his pockets. Man, once you've been around, you just don't want to do it anymore. It's better to just stay back, where you don't have to worry about it, where they can't fuck with you." "Who told you about this guy?" I asked, still chuckling. But he just closed his eyes and trembled, and that's when it stopped, sounding like one of his schizoid jokes. "You know, if anyone messes with you, just tell me, kiddo, and I'll fuck 'em up. You know that. Don't let anyone pull any of that shit with you. Promise me, man," he said. "Okay, but where'd you hear about it?" I asked again. "I'm praying to the aliens," he said. "What?" I asked. He was really out of it. "I just heard about what happens from my uncle, okay? He's the one who came all the way here to help me with my game," he said, fiddling with his charm bracelet. It was dusk before we separated for the day and dark by the time I made it home. Mom was sleeping on the couch when I stepped in. That day I'd let whatever was going on between her and Dad stay their problem, just like always, until they made it my problem, which they soon did. It wasn't until I lay down in my bed that I realized I'd left Dad's basketball over at Broder's house. It was okay, though. I'd get it back. See, we called the water tower tripod because it looked like one of those alien walkers from War of the Worlds. Its shape made it the perfect backdrop for after-school war games, and beneath it we jungle kids would storm the battleground backwards, blasting each other with sand and sticks to root out the space invaders. They didn't last, and not long after I started those little adventures with tripod, the other kids would head home, and with nowhere to turn when my mom worked late, I'd head for the laps, out where Broder and I would hang. I had long ago climbed the short tree in the yard to the top and boarded every main block and sidewalk till holes wore through my rubble sole sneaks and socks, so I knew those dead ends didn't take you anywhere. But little pockets of life crept up between the properties where the land couldn't be filled, like near Tripod and the tracks. They were little mosquito oases of woods and other nature shit resting in the gridlock, run-off gullies of bullfrog groves and stream beds thick with poison ivy and pine needles, and for some reason long before I ever arrived, kids were calling these patches the lapses. Sure, a kid could find some shade around the baseball diamonds, but there wasn't much to do there save for sitting on the grass or guardrails, and every now and then we'd hit the streets with sticks from some kid's flat to chase a puck, but moving out for the passing cars grew old too fast and pointless. That's why we liked the lapses, because down in that shady cool, we could get away with mischief games and fights. We'd swear, we'd spit, piss, burp, and fart. We'd even jack off. We'd jump around like apes knuckling the ground, ripping up roots and kicking and clobbering each other till we drew out blood. It was fun. So whenever the pounding at home got tiring, we'd run out to the woods to have a go with nature. Only far from home in the madding crowd could a boy feel that free. No Man's Land, it wasn't just some movie's war speak to me, which is why I'd asked Mom about it. I'd actually heard of it before. It was a real place, and the lapse was right on the edge of it. If you followed the trails far enough with the tracks, you'd eventually come to the border. A 6-foot-tall fence stood in your way, and if there weren't the occasional holes and missing boards, it would have appeared like the edge of the world. If you could get around or underneath it, you were no longer in the neighborhood. You were in a different world, walking the embankments of the railroad and on your own. That was No Man's Land to me. I knew it as the place you didn't come back from if you went, so I never bothered going. Back in the normal burbs, though, my world was one with limits. They were everywhere once I left the basement, all the places a kid just couldn't go, from the fences around Tripod to the border of No Man's Land, from the real-world private property and high-voltage signs to the make-believe ion zones, deep pits, and gendered hangouts. We all felt safer labeling what to keep each other away from. Back then I thought of my entire neighborhood as one big video game and saw everyone playing a part in it, young and old, boy and girl. The neighborhood warfare was always a force easy to incite and tough to break down, especially the girls, who often looked and dressed like boys back then just to confuse me more. So the others never called me Jared out of the house. All the kids had a nickname outside because everyone had secrets out there, like me and Broder. And this was true no matter where you ended up. Code names kept things down low from the adults. They all knew me as Kiddo, because I was the youngest. Trash piled up out there. Cigarette butts stuck in the tread of our sneaks, and cans and glass clogged the mucky duckweed creek. Guys sat on the concrete playing cards and breaking bottles on the rocks. No one cleaned and no one cared. The kids my age went home when the sun set, and the older guys like Broder lingered on behind doing God knows what. I kept a lot secret from Mom, but she was rarely around to ask me where I was anyways. If anything, I was too free to run barefoot in the broken glass. My sneakers were already full of holes. But every summer day held possibilities for me. Maybe I'd run into Tosh shooting hoops in his driveway with Jetter, the kid with a mouthful of metal and a broken wrist. Or maybe I'd run down to see Sprocket, the ticket into town who'd take you anywhere on his girl's bike. If you had the freedom to move, you ruled the street and all the kids on it, and if any kid could be measured in worth by miles, there were few I knew who could top Sprocket. Without my skateboard, I would have been all but grounded by comparison, and all of us had stories about the laps. In fact, that other kid called Tosh once threw me up against a tree there for no other reason than to let off steam, so I let him have it across the face, and we wrestled on the ground for a while trying to pin each other. As if anticipating a fight, he always clad himself in his father's old Nam helmet, his dad being a bit unstable and otherwise distracted after the war, and that helmet being pretty much all he had left of him. "I'll fucking kill you," he strained, pushing me on my ass. "You think my dad's a piece of work? Well, at least I have one, asshole." That was the time I learned why you never make fun of someone else's dad. Every other kid had one. So I knew a lot of kids in my hood, but none of them gave me the attention Broder did. I was good for a game to them, but that was it. Broder actually cared about making me feel good, about making me feel like a cool guy like him. Out there I could be as nasty as I wanted with myself, and he'd encourage it. I loved his bravado and just wanted a spoonful of it for myself. So I wore my cool shades. I slouched around. I rested my hands down in my crotch just like he did. I watched all the violent movies. I practiced my swearing. I burped and farted anytime, anywhere, with no apologies. I snapped pop cans and guzzled them in one manly gulp, crinkled them one-handed, and threw them in the trash like a jump shot. Mom saw me do it. "You did not just drink that whole thing at once, did you?" she had asked. She always made me feel guilty. Did it really matter how fast I drank a pop? Sheesh, I thought. Aren't I allowed to be a guy? Every time she got on my case like that, I'd run over to Broder's. He was the only one who understood me and what I wanted in life, even if it felt like I was always playing catch-up with him. But when I did catch him, it was in the crotch. It was the same thrill I'd feel when lying in my bed at night with the images of those naked static bodies on TV flashing through my head. They took over everything. They could turn the silent night in the bedroom into a flesh carnival, like neon and flashbulbs pulsing under cloth and skin in the dark behind my eyes. Just as I would out there in the sticks, I'd start getting into it deep and hard in bed, brushing and twisting in the sheets with everything I had in me, wet with sweat until it burst and sucked back in on itself like getting crotch slammed by a wave at the beach or hitting the bottom of the Ferris wheel to leave me there washed up in the sand, gasping for breath and back in bed again. Broder knew how good that thrill felt down there and how I could never get enough, so he let me have as much as I wanted in the laps, where it would just be us guys. July 3rd, 1981. Dreamed last night I was locked in my room and had to dig out, but hid some weird milk in a hole. I laid there, at the fences, I think, and something was sitting on me, or holding me down, and a snake was going up my back, and I couldn't move, but I was awake.